So first we talked about how life is organized. That was the first characteristic of life. The next thing we're going to talk about is how life requires materials and energy. Everything that is alive, whether it is plants or animals or bacteria, every living thing requires energy in order to maintain its organization and carry out with life's activities. Energy is just the capacity to do work. It's obtained from the organism's external environment. Ultimately, all of our energy is going to come back from sunlight. Sunlight is going to be the ultimate source of energy for life on Earth, and solar energy is going to be stored as chemical energy by organisms such as plants and algae that are going to undergo photosynthesis. This energy can be taken up by organisms that do not photosynthesize, but consume organisms that do. So even if you are unable to produce your own chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis, you can eat plants that do undergo photosynthesis. Fish can eat algae that undergo photosynthesis, and bears can eat fish. And this is how that whole flow of energy works. So here's just an example of what that looks like. Here, I'm going to get my laser pointer out again. And here we go. So an important aspect of any ecosystem is going to be the energy flow and the chemical cycling. And we'll talk about both. Chemicals are not used up when organisms die. They just move from one population to another through the food chain. They move from producers to consumers to decomposers and back to producers. So for example, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere by producers. Plants take up carbon dioxide and they turn it into glucose. That glucose is taken up by consumers. Consumers eat those producers. Carbon enters their bodies, and then when those organisms die, they are going to be taken up by decomposers. Decomposers are going to break down that final form of carbon and release it back into the atmosphere. So carbon goes through a very specific chemical cycle. Chemicals are not going to be used up. They are simply cycled from producers to consumers to decomposers and back up to producers again. Energy, on the other hand, does not do this. Energy does not cycle in the environment. It actually just flows in one direction. It's kind of like a river. It flows downhill. It all flows in one direction. Energy is going to flow from the sun. That's going to be an ultimate source of energy. So from the sun to the plants, and then from the plants onto the consumers, and from the consumers onto the decomposers, all the way down through the food chain. In order to maintain life on Earth, there has to be a constant input of solar energy at each stage of the chemical conversion. So when we convert solar energy into chemical energy, a great deal of that energy is going to be lost or given off in the environment as heat. Heat is the least usable form of energy. There's not a whole lot that we can do with it. So it's considered sort of lost to us, or a loss of energy, even though the energy hasn't gone anywhere. It's just changed from one form to the next. So that solar energy is going to be transformed into chemical energy, and a lot of that energy is going to be given off as heat. When those producers are eaten by the consumers, a great deal of your energy is going to be given off in the form of heat. When those consumers die and begin to decompose, a great deal of that energy is going to finally be given off as heat. This is why decomposition piles or compost piles actually can get very hot and spontaneously combust. It's because of all the heat that's being given off by the decomposers. So that's going to be our second characteristic of life. Life requires materials and energy. The next characteristic of life is that life requires homeostasis. All living things have to maintain homeostasis. And homeostasis is just the maintenance of internal conditions within certain boundaries. So it's absolutely essential that organisms maintain a state of biological balance. So in order to maintain that, we have to have feedback systems in order to monitor our internal conditions and make adjustments. For example, when you get too cold, what does your body do to help maintain homeostasis if the temperature drops? You shiver. This is your body's way of trying to increase your internal temperature. If you get too hot, what does your body do? You start to sweat. This is, again, a way that your body helps maintain homeostasis, to help keep the temperature inside your body relatively constant, even though your environment is constantly changing. So life requires homeostasis. Now, along with that, in order to maintain homeostasis, life has to be responsive. So all living things have to be able to respond to external stimuli, whether that's the environment or other organisms. We have to be able to interact with the environment and respond to changes in the environment. So, for example, we have to be able to sense and pursue nutrients and or avoid dangers or harmful substances. Even bacteria do this. They have to be aware that, oh, there are nutrients that way, there's danger that way, I'm going to go where the nutrients are. So this ability to respond often produces movement. For example, leaves will actually turn towards sunlight. Animals avoid predators. Response ensures the survival of that organism. And the response of an organism to its environment is classified as its behaviors. Hopefully, I'm not sure yet, but hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about behavioral ecology and how animal and plant and living matter behaves in its environment and its interactions with other organisms. Organisms will display a variety of behaviors to help maintain homeostasis, search and compete for energy, nutrients, shelter, mates, all of those things. Life also must be able to reproduce and develop. All living things reproduce and develop. Life comes from life, thus all forms of life must have the ability to reproduce. So, for example, bacteria, protists, many single-celled organisms reproduce by splitting themselves in two. This is what's known as asexual reproduction. In more complex multicellular organisms, the reproductive process requires genetic contribution from a male and a female of the same species. And an important step in reproduction is going to be not just the initial reproduction of a new single-celled organism, but also the growth and the development of that new individual into its mature adult form. When organisms reproduce, they pass on copies of their genetic information, also known as genes, to the next generation. And the genes are going to determine the characteristics of that organism. Those genes are going to be ultimately composed of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about DNA throughout this chapter, or throughout this course. Finally, our last characteristic of life is that life is adaptive. All living things can undergo adaptation, and adaptation is going to be any modification that makes an organism better suited for its specific environment. Now, this isn't responsiveness. This is not number 4, life is responsive. This is not about instantaneous changes to the environment, but it's about long-term adaptations of the species as a whole to become more suited to its particular environment. This is going to be done through evolution, which is just the change of a population of organisms over time to become better suited to its particular environment. So that's it. That's all I have for the characteristics of life. Next, we're going to talk about evolution and its relationship to the characteristics of life, specifically about this final point here on life being adaptive.